Tonight's topic, War in the Tropics, to me sounds like a Turner classic movie. I am hoping that I am Audrey Hepburn, and if I were casting the film, I could ask for no better gentleman to lead us on this maritime story this evening. Both are recognized historians, researchers, and lecturers, onshore and at sea. They have so much in common. Robert's specialty being the Florida waters and the Caribbean, and John Corstein's obviously the Virginia, Eastern Shore, our end of the world here in Virginia. They are both prolific authors who became fast friends when I introduced them on Zoom a while back, and I think that friendship will continue. Robert Maycomber was initially scheduled to be with us last May in person in that concourse that is now opened up, which is fabulous. But we had to cancel that because of the pandemic. And I was so happy that he agreed to appear virtually this evening from his home on Pine Island in Southwest Florida. Robert is perhaps best known for his 15 honor series novels following U.S. naval officer Peter Wake, whose life from the in service from the American Civil War to the Spanish American War is covered in this prolific series of books. The latest, Word of Honor, earned Robert the accolade of 2020 Florida Writer of the Year by the Florida Writers Association. He is certainly at work on the next book, which I think will be his 16th out of 17 planned stories that follow Peter Wake. His fans are called Wakians, and I am now an official Wakian with my koozie. So if you want to join Robert, go to robertmaycomber.com and sign up for his newsletter. Quarterly, it's fabulous. When Robert is not writing or researching, he loves sailing and cooking exotic cuisines from his novels and his extensive travels. And of course, those familiar with the Mariners Museum know John Corstein, Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center, and a regular lecturer and blogger for us for our Civil War in Hampton Roads history series. A recognized Civil War historian and ironclad ship authority, John is the author of 20 books, of which I think I've edited 10 of them. He writes a lot. And his books about ironclads, the Monitor Boys, the crew of the Union's first ironclad, and CSS Virginia, Sink Before Surrender, are recognized as some of the top books on this subject. He has produced, written, and narrated many PBS documentaries, including the film series Civil War in Hampton Roads. And John joins us from his home near Blackbeard's Point in Hampton, Virginia. So I'm happy to present this dynamic duo to you now, starring in War in the Tropics, Robert Maycomber and John Corstein.
Well, hello there. I think Robert's coming on now. I want to thank you all for being with us this evening. Of course, I'm John Corstein, and we're going to be making some great stories that actually some of them are connected directly to, well, we here on the Virginia Peninsula and we here in Hampton Roads. I think my favorite story that I shared with Robert was, one of the commanders of the USS Monitor was a man known as Commander Thomas Holdrup Stevens Jr. Now, he was a good officer, however, and he's connected to Robert's stories about Florida because he captures Fort Clinch as well as Tallahassee and Jacksonville. He is, but he eventually becomes captain of the Monitor. If you all remember William Keeler, that teetotaling acting assistant paymaster, said that he thought Stevens was too fond of a glass. In fact, one day in the wardroom, they're at dinner and Stevens looks down the table and he looks at the paymaster. He says, "Mr. Paymaster, I know you're an abstemious man, but I am not. Pass me the whiskey." And so, and there are other things. He fell down one day in front of a senior officer, Thomas Turner, and he fell down drunk, and so he was taken off the monitor. So, but sailors like to drink, and they also like to. And I think our hero that Robert writes about likes to drink sometimes a little bit, doesn't he, Robert?
Yes, he does. Just a touch of rum, but it has to be good rum.
Great. So, when we started talking about doing this program, we realized there were so many important connections from Cape Charles all the way down to Key West. And that's where, of course, Robert likes to focus his work on. And it's all because of what we know as Scott's Great Snake. Could I have a slide, Tim? There you go. And of course, this is all about the Great Blockade. And I have to tell you, this is 3,000 miles of coastline. And it's not just fast steamers coming from Bermuda into Wilmington. There's other types of blockade runners and the other types of blockaders who have this monotonous duty. And that's what Robert has studied so much. And that's what makes his novels, when you're a Civil War historian and you read it, you go, oh my gosh, I could be there. So Robert, tell us a little bit about the blockade in Florida. One thing I was always fascinated about was that Pensacola was almost where the Civil War began instead of Charleston. And so
exactly. And John, a lot of people don't know that the reinforcements were originally going to go to Pensacola, and they ended up going to Charleston. There were 6,000 Confederate troops under a fellow who later became well known. I'll be polite. His name was Bragg. And he had surrounded the minuscule Union forces in Pensacola. They had that gentleman's agreement: if you don't shoot, we won't shoot. And so if those reinforcements had ended up at Pensacola, that would have been a battle. And when I talk about Florida in the Civil War and the blockade, I would like to give a 30-second background on Florida in 1861. Florida had the smallest population of any Confederate state, had the largest ratio of black slaves to almost any state, and it was the third state to secede long before some of the more famous. Here's another piece of trivia for you. Florida had the highest volunteer rate to serve in the Confederate armed forces of any Confederate state as a ratio of volunteers to available military. So 1 out of 3 Floridians who served in both in the Army and the Navy, and they served in Northern Virginia, they served in the Western Theater. 1 out of 3 killed, wounded, or POW. And they came back to a state that was one of 2 states who were never captured during the war. The Union tried to invade 2 times and failed both times to get to Tallahassee. But it was a different kind of state than all the other states. Because we had less population, because there were vast areas of the coastline that were little known and underpopulated, that made us a blockade runner's haven. When the war started and the Navy, ordered by Lincoln, after General Scott's idea of this Great Snake Anaconda plan, the Navy, didn't have many ships. Certainly didn't have many ships that were serviceable and in home waters. And so they divided this blockade basically from the peninsula of Florida up and from the peninsula of Florida west. Key West was one of the last, in fact, one of the only U.S. Navy stations It was only a supply base at first. That had not been captured by the Confederates, so that became the base of operations for the Gulf blockading. They had a grand total of 6 ships, 6, to blockade from Cape Canaveral down around the Florida Keys and all the way to the Rio Grande River. Now, that, of course, stupid. They couldn't do it. The Navy built up, and it took a while, but finally they separated the Gulf blockading squadron into 2 parts. The West Gulf Gulf blockading squadron became very famous under a fellow named Farragut. And the East Gulf blockading squadron had the area of operations, and this is the interesting part. From Cape Canaveral down around the peninsula, Apalachicola, and also the British Bahamas, Spanish Cuba, and French Yucatan, Mexico. This squadron ended up with 38 ships, but it took a while to build up. For the first 2 years, they were behind the game all over the place. During the last 2 years, they became more and more effective until they shut down most of the blockade. But those first 2 to 3 years were really something. Fortunes. So that's it in an overview. We'll get into more detail here. Tom, that's it in an overview.
Yeah, the blockade was an amazing. I did a lot of studies on the blockade board, and it was, at first they said, oh, we don't need this many ships. Of course, the U.S. Navy had 93 ships, and of those, I think 43 were serviceable, and some of them were very questionable as to their service. The U.S. Navy ended up having over 600 ships in its Navy, and most of those were bought, like ferry boats and some schooners. I think depends on where you were in the blockade serving, you would have different styles of ships. And so the U.S. Navy, to maintain this blockade, had to compete with merchant ships and actually the Army. The Army thought they were so smart, they decided they wanted to buy warships as well. So it becomes, if you owned a couple of ferry boats, you made a few dollars. And but this blockade that Robert has alluded to is simply the main way we got these supplies. But Florida also had other great importance. Isn't it the second largest cattle producer in the nation today?
Yes, yeah, it still is the second largest cattle producer. Everybody thinks of Florida, they think of Disney World money, but it's a huge agriculture. The island I live on is a vast agricultural island in Florida. Florida served as a great supplier of beef to the Army of Tennessee and also salt to the Army of Tennessee. And so they would take that up by rail. And as the war progressed in the Western Theater and the Confederate armies were retreating, the supplies from Florida kept them literally alive. And they were absolutely crucial. The blockaders knew that. And so there were a lot of joint Army and Navy, mainly Navy, but some Army amphibious raids that were going after both salt works on the coast and also cattle. There were actually amphibious raids where they were trying to go after cattle operations. In this area of Florida where I live, the southernmost land battle of the Civil War was fought at Fort Myers, Florida. That's the southernmost land battle east of the Rio Grande. I have to add that. Right. But one of the factors in that operation was to round up enemy cows, Confederate cows, stop them from being sent north. to the Confederate armies. So the blockade squadron headquarters in Key West became the hub of the U.S. Army operations in Florida and also U.S. Navy operations. Fortunately, the Navy commander, the Navy admiral, and the Army general became friends, and their joint operations were very successful. It also was the supply transit point for any U.S. warship that was coming from up north and going into the Gulf of Mexico to the West Gulf Blockade Squadron. They always stopped at Key West by school. So it was very, very important role.
Yeah, and that's pretty fabulous when we start to think of the importance of Florida. Many don't recognize it, but at Key West, it controlled the entrance into the Gulf of Mexico, basically. But one thing I really like is that right off of Florida is, of course, Cuba. And, you know, we, number one, have several commerce raiders that run through there. Raphael Semmes takes the CSS Sumter. And of course, John Newland Maffett becomes a tremendous hero on board your state's namesake ship in the Confederacy, the CSS Florida. And, you know, Maffett is such a great leader that they go to Cuba, they arm themselves and everything, then they have to go to Mobile Bay. And he basically is sick from yellow fever like the rest of his crew. And somehow Maffett runs this ship through the blockade and into Mobile Bay. And when they emerge, what do they become, Robert?
Well, when they emerged from Mobile Bay.
Yes, they went on their cruise.
Yeah, they went on the cruise,
Yeah.
and they ended up down in South America, and at that point, there was a very interesting confrontation with the United States Navy, the Wachusett, down in Bahia. And I've been to Bahia, and I've been to where all this happened. And it was amazing, the story of the U.S. Navy versus the Confederate Navy in Brazil. And most people don't know that this war was a world war between the navies. So that Navy, that operation led to a whole lot of repercussions.
Yeah. Actually, the Florida will be captured, as you know,
Yep.
by the Massachusetts, and then it's towed to Newport News Point, where the Brazilians said, "Well, you illegally captured that." And so the commander of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, then David Dixon Porter, when he's ordered to return the ship, he says, "Return no damn rebel vessel." And somehow there was an accident, wasn't there, Robert?
Yes, one of the tugs in that squadron accidentally collided with the anchored ship and sank her at her anchor. And then the Secretary of the Navy, the notorious Gideon Wells, had to explain to the ambassador from Brazil that, gosh, there's been an unfortunate accident, and we can't give you back your ship. We really wanted to, but we can't because it's at the bottom of the Chesapeake. How about that?
So much goes to Florida, but it
Yeah.
was, I think, the second most successful commerce raider for the Confederacy. And so, and it did ply those waters of the Caribbean for much of its career. It actually went all the way up to New England and back.
Yes, and that's an interesting story in itself. Very briefly, two lieutenants are sitting in Florida, and they're discussing what strategy they should use. I've used this as a lecture to the Office of Naval Intelligence on planning strategy. And they decided to hit the enemy, i.e. the Union, where they least expected it and where it would hurt the most. Now, these guys are sitting in a port in Brazil, 2 lieutenants, and they decide to go all the way from Brazil to the coast of New England, from New York Harbor to Portland, Maine, and they did a raid in 1863, and during that raid, they captured or destroyed 26 ships, caused pandemonium. Everybody on the coast was terrified. All the ship owners were terrified. And by the way, one of the ships that was captured was the JL Maycomber, my name, out of New London. No, Mystic, Connecticut. Yes.
Yeah, that's that. They captured 2 smaller ships, the Talcony and
Yes.
the Clarence, and actually Charles Reed goes into the Portland Harbor and tries to steal a Coast Guard vessel.
Yeah,
Get
yeah.
the steam up, and so he got captured. But that just shows how daring these people had to be during this time. And of course, in your books, you get this daring feel of how the blockade, many people think the blockade was dull. And you can read the book by Charles Stedman, and he will say blockading is dull, dull, duller. But there are these moments of excitement that are beyond comparison, whether you're a blockade runner or a blockader themselves. And I think your main character does that several times, doesn't he?
John, yes, he does. And here's the situation. They were not tethered by communications to headquarters. So they had autonomy and they used innovation. And there was nobody to stop them. And so when you get 2 lieutenants together, even today on a U.S. warship, they start talking about the way it should be, what we ought to be doing. Imagine if nobody senior to them is around them. There's no communication with them, and they go ahead and do it. That's what happened there.
Yeah.
And it happened on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
I've run into many instances of blockade runners, blockade ships, the U.S. Navy, that did not follow orders, that went 200, 250 miles off their patrol station just to go to more lucrative cruising grounds, some of which were in foreign territorial waters, and ended up in gunfights where they weren't supposed to be, contradictory to international law, and international incidents then ensued. That happened all the time during the war with the East Gulf Blockading Squadron, because it was in close proximity to the foreign empires, France, Britain, and Spain. So you get U.S. Navy gunboat captains who are lieutenants also. And they feel their oaths. Some of them are ensigns, some of them are just masters. And there's nobody to say no. So they head off. And it's funny to read the reports afterwards, where the admirals are denying that their ships would ever do that, they would always follow orders. And yet there are eyewitnesses that they're in Spanish territorial waters, Cuba. At one point, San Jacinto actually ran up on the reef and was destroyed in the Bahamas on a key, Tropics. And it's a little hard to say they're not in your territorial waters when the shipwreck is so rare. So there's lots of stories like that. And yes, I draw upon those stories in my books. And Peter Wake, the main character, this naval officer, is one of those guys who thinks, okay, here's what we need to do. Let's do it. So yes.
Yeah, I would kind of tell you the blockader's motivation is that if he captures a blockade runner, he gets to share in the profits of the sale of the ship and everything on board. John Pine Bankhead stopped one blockade runner when he was in command of the USS Florida, and they were starting to throw cotton overboard, and he had his 10-inch pivot gun pointing at him and says, "One more bail and you get one more shot." And so, they gave up. But I think talking about how they went over territorial waters, one of the big incidents that happened in Cuban waters is, of course, you already mentioned the San Jacinto. Its commander, Charles Wilkes, was this guy who thought he was the greatest thing walking on a ship deck, if not the world, if not the air. And he was a famous Arctic explorer. However, he was impetuous, and he actually causes an incident that almost brings us into war with Great Britain, doesn't it, Robert?
Yes, the Trent affair.
Yeah, so that was was one of those. I mean, what basically Wilkes did, he was looking for the CSS Sumter, which had gone down there, couldn't find it. Then he heard that the envoys to Great Britain and France were actually in Cuba, going to book a passage to Europe. These guys were supposed to go on this ship called the CSS Nashville. They said, "Oh, no. We're going to go down to Cuba. It'll be safe on a Royal Mail steamer, Trent." And what happened to them?
Well, they ended up getting captured, and the Brits ended up getting enraged, and they finally were allowed to go free, and got free passage over to Britain. That is just one example, but that is probably, I think, in the entire war, that's probably the most egregious and glorious example. There were so many others just like.
Mm-hmm. Do you know some of those stories?
Oh, well, in the Bahamas, the North American squadron of the Royal Navy had at least 2 station ships in the Bahamas at all times. They were headquartered out of Halifax, Canada, and they were constantly on patrol, and they were turning most of them turned a blind eye for the first year or so of the war. Then they started enforcing the neutrality laws against Confederates. Prior to that, they did not. They did occasionally run into the Confederates. Some of the Confederate raiders were actually taken to the Bahamas and armed there and through there early in the war. Then, as the war continued, the U.S. Navy expanded and had more ships that could devote themselves to patrolling theoretically around these territorial waters. But they did. There's a shipwreck in, let me see, off of Ironclad that was a small U.S. Navy vessel. San Jacinto is in the northern Bahamas. Shipwreck, you can dive her today. And then on the coast of Cuba, there is a great example of a Navy ensign who is supposed to be blockading near the Swanee River. That's in upper Florida on the west coast, on the Gulf Coast. And he leaves that area because he's already captured and caused mayhem among the Confederate blockade runners. There's nobody else left to catch. So they end up sailing his schooner, Annie, which was a blockade runner taken into the U.S. Navy. He sails her almost 300 miles down to the Cuban coast. And between Matanzas and Havana on the north central Cuban coast, he spots a British ship, cargo ship. And he determines, now he's in territorial waters, he determines that she must be a blockade runner. And so he's going to capture her. He knows he's in territorial water, but he thinks he can get away with it. He ends up firing the warning shot And they now put the Brits put all sail up, and they're now going faster. He speeds up, puts all sail up. He fires another shot. They ignore that. Now they're flying every British flag they have. And he then fires around to try to disable her. And that's a good point that many people don't realize. You never fired, if you were the US Navy, you never fired into the hull of the blockade runner. You want to capture the blockade runner for the money, not damage the cargo. So he fires a round into the rigging. That round goes through the main sheet, which is the controlling line of the largest sail on this British ship. That was a large topsail schooner also. And it parts the line just above the British captain's head. So we're not firing a warning shot to him. He's now trying to hit the rigging. And they fire one more round, same time that the Brit rounds the point and enters Matanzas Harbor. The Spanish man their fort on the point, and the American sailors are pointing out to their ensign in charge that it looks like that fort's about to shoot us, and they'll probably hit us. So he then breaks it off. And he quietly sails the 300 miles back to his patrol area. It took a grand total of 1 day for that British captain to go from Matanzas to Havana, talk to the British ambassador, and then the next ship that was heading for Great Britain took the complaint from the Spanish and the British over to London. Then the next ship to the United States from Great Britain took the complaint, and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Navy ended up having to deal with a very irate Spanish ambassador and British ambassador. And the Secretary of Navy, Gideon Welles, explained that his men would never, ever do such a thing. And they knew the international law, and they followed rules and regulations. This was completely misunderstood. It was somebody else's ship. In fact, even suggested it was another Confederate pirate that did this. Then he contacts the admiral in Key West. The admiral in Key West says, no, my men would never do this. And they start checking with the various ship captains, and guess which one they couldn't find? That's Ensign Williams of the USS. So they finally find him, and he is brought down to Key West, and he is, as the admiral finally said in his report later on, admitting that he had a, quote, overzealous officer who will never, ever do such a thing again. So I think that everybody who's been in the Navy or in any of the services can imagine that ensign probably had a very stern talking to. He lost his command, and Ensign Williams is lost to history. I don't know what happened.
That's like
we didn't know in Alaska, so they couldn't assign him there. But
that's like so many people; they just kind of disappear.
Yeah, when they get in trouble.
And I run across that a lot.
Yeah.
But one thing I want us to talk about before, I can't believe we've already been on here 40 minutes, but what I'd like to do is one of the most daring or dangerous ships everyone thought was the Ironclad Stonewall, which was originally, I like this ship because it's got so many names. And, it starts out as a Sphinx, and it's going to be built for the Khedive of Egypt. And then for some odd reason, a conversation is broken with the Khedive, and he goes, I don't want a ship, And so they said, oh, this is contraband. Well, then the Second Schleswig War, which I don't think that's going to be on our test right later. And it gets sold to the Danes, and they call it the Stockcode, and which depends on where you are in Denmark. It's going to be strong otter or this mythical giant with 8 arms. Well, the Danes lose the war. They don't need the boat anymore. The Confederates need the boat. And so they buy the boat back. And it gets to Feral Spain when it begins its voyage overseas. It's under the command of Thomas Jefferson Page, because Thomas Page was born at Roswell, which is not too far from where I'm sitting now, great ruin. But so what happens to that ship, and what made it such a special thing?
Well, John, it was reputed to be the strongest armored and armed ocean-going ironclad in the world. And it terrified the U.S. Navy. And what we have to remember is the U.S. Navy Mediterranean Squadron had been reduced in strength during the war. They needed ships over there and more ships over here. So it was down to 2 ships, and those 2 ships were in a Feral. At the time that the Stonewall appeared offshore. And Thomas Page was a pretty, he felt very good about being captain of this powerful warship. And so he challenged the 2 U.S. warships under Commodore Craven. Yes, that's a name that many people know, to come out and do battle, even though they outnumbered them 2-1. They were wooden, and he felt very confident that he could humiliate them and either sink or terribly damage them. So for 2.5 days, he steamed back and forth off that Spanish port, demanding that they come out and fight like men. And for 2 days, they refused. Commodore Craven. He then leaves and heads west. Now, by the way, Commodore Craven had to go through a court-martial.
Yes.
And that's a whole other story. But so he's heading west. Now, this is now in April of 1865, and we have to put everything in context. Lincoln has been assassinated. Stewart has been butchered in his head. Nobody knows who's going to be assassinated next. Washington is in lockdown, and the Confederate government has fled from Richmond and is heading south. The game plan, and of course, Jefferson Davis, who couldn't keep a secret, like depended on it, and, was telling everybody that they were going to fight on in the Appalachian Mountains. Fortunately, he decided not to do that. Wiser heads prevailed upon him. And plan B was to get to Texas. 2 states were undefeated and uncaptured, Florida and Texas. He couldn't get from Texas directly from Virginia. The Union forces controlled the Mississippi and had occupied large areas. So the game plan was to get down to Florida and then go to Texas that way. Now, he is captured in Irwinville, Georgia in early May. And much of his cabinet then kind of disappear, including the great Secretary of the Navy, the Confederacy, a Floridian, Stephen Mallory, and 3 members of the Confederate cabinet, 3 senior members, Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, Attorney General, make it to Florida. They're heading south. And if you are a Union commander, if you're the Navy commander in Key West or the Army commander in Key West or leadership in Washington, you are terrified. This war isn't ending. It didn't end at Appomattox. There's still fights going on. And if those 3 guys decide to go down Cuba, get a ship to go over to French Mexico, French pro-Confederate Mexico, cross the Rio Grande, you can wade across, and then carry on the fight with Kirby Smith, other Florida, by the way, General Kirby Smith in Texas, 35,000 man undefeated army. This war is going to drag on forever. And now we have this monster ironclad steaming west towards the Caribbean from Azores. last seen in the Azores. And on May 11th, it arrives, means past Key West, and it arrives in Havana Harbor. Havana Harbor was for many years a pro-Confederate harbor. At the end of the war, they were starting to enforce their neutrality. And the Spanish governor, Domingo Dulce, yes, that actually was his Sunday, gets a letter from the admiral in Key West, a South Carolinian named Cornelius Stribling, who stayed loyal to the U.S. Navy. Cornelius Stribling, without any authorization, we've talked about ensigns doing stuff without authorization. Here is a rear admiral doing it. He writes a letter to the Spanish governor, U.S., and he basically, to paraphrase the letter, puts 3 points in the letter. The Stonewall no longer has a government. Item 2. Therefore, if the Stonewall emerges from your harbor, she will be, and does anything, she will be a pirate committing piracy against all the laws of all the nations. And 3, anybody who aids and abets Stonewall in committing piracy will suffer all the consequences. Take a moment to think about it. It's not a declaration or ultimatum of war towards Cuba. That's towards the entire Spanish global empire.
You're right.
Did he have permission to do that one?
No.
I want to meet him when I get to heaven. I think that I get to meet anybody I want. One of the ones I want to meet. Ask him, what's in your mind? The Spanish governor gets this letter and realizes, what is the largest standing army victorious for the U.S. Army? What's the largest victorious Navy in the world? The U.S. Navy. Yes, the Royal Navy was bigger, but ours was victorious. And what island did the U.S. always covet above all others in the Caribbean? Cuba. Do we really want to push that, to save this Confederate ship in our water? At the same time, Stribling wrote a letter to Thomas Page. They were good friends before the war. They were both, Southerners, good friends. He begs Page not to come out, not to shed further blood. At the same time, Cornelius Stribling only has 3 small gunboats in his harbor at Key West. Each one is headed by a lieutenant. He calls the 3 lieutenants into his headquarters, which, by the way, still exist in Key West at Clinton Square. And he says to them the following orders: you will take your gunboats down to Havana. You will patrol offshore in international waters. You will wait until the monster comes out, and then you will throw yourselves at her and try to slow her down and do as much damage as you can for as long as you can. This is now the middle of May, 1865, a month after Lee has surrendered. There are 450 men on these 3 ships, 150. And they are about to go into battle and probably die. And so they go forth, they do their job. And the confluence of all these factors, by Stribling, by the Spanish governor, by Thomas Page, who refused to surrender his ship, refused to do what Stribling wanted. After all, he'd already humiliated the U.S. Navy in Spain. Finally, the Spanish governor explains to Thomas Page, he can't let him out of the harbor. And Page says, okay, I will never surrender my vessel, but I will voluntarily decommission. Be different. And they decommissioned her. The Spanish agreed to pay off all her harbor debts, which we supply and refuel. And the crew played Dixie, lowered the flag, went by boat ashore, and disappeared into heaven. The story doesn't end there. Thomas Page ended up in Argentina.
Right.
He ended up becoming an admiral in the Argentine Navy. His son ended up becoming an Argentine naval officer, and his grandson became the first naval aviator in Argentina.
And
So
you know,
if you go to
Robert, I
Argentina,
met that family. They
what?
came up to Virginia, and I took them to Roswell,
Yeah,
and it was just amazing. That was an amazing experience. And you know, I read Thomas Page's letters, and he actually said that the boat leaked badly, that it was hard to steer because if you look at this picture, that monstrous ram,
yes.
that ram, yes, it could sink a monitor, yes, it could sink a wooden ship, but it made it difficult to steer. He said, this ship, I'm not afraid if I had another ironclad to sink this one. And
Yeah, and she was also underpowered.
oh, without a doubt.
So
It was
there's a letter
still,
from the Spanish governor to Stribling, and it's a full flowery.
yeah.
Listen, it's with great joy in my heart that I present to you for free this state-of-the-art warship. And if you only pay the expenses that we incurred, which was $6,000 in order to pay off these debts. Finally, the Navy gets down there. They take control of the ship. They take it up to Hampton Roads, and they examine this monster that everybody was afraid of. They find out she's underpowered, can't maneuver well, and within 2 years, the United States ends up giving her away to the Imperial Japanese.
Yeah. and that's how she gets her third and fourth and fifth names.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Kodestu and the Azuma. And actually the Azuma was near oh gosh. Well, anyway, served actively in the Spanish Navy or the Japanese Navy until 1908, which is hard to
Yes.
believe.
She was one of the major ships in the first Sino-Japanese War, Chinese-Japanese War in 1894-95, and she ended up getting decommissioned eventually, became a fishing hulk, and finally sank.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's really amazing because this ship played a huge role in the what's called the Meiji Restoration, where the emperor overthrew the shogunate and said, we're going to modernize. Look at this modern ship we've got. Bows and arrows that the samurais wanted to use did not work well against this ship. No matter how bad of a sailor it was, no matter how slow, it still had 100-pounder Armstrong gun and 3 80-pounder Armstrong guns. So
yeah, it was physically intimidating.
right.
It was visually intimidating. And in the court martial of Craven later on, Gideon Wells wanted blood for Craven not doing battle in Spain. And the board of the court martial was composed of men who had been in combat against officers who had been in combat against Ironclad. And they found him basically not guilty.
Mm-hmm.
When the verdict of that court got to Gideon Wells, he got really upset, told them to redo the trial, and they ended up having to redo the trial because the Secretary of the Navy ordered it.
Yeah.
And they then found him guilty, but they sentenced him to a very minor punishment. And then about 6 months later, they vacated the punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And he went on to have a very good career.
Yeah, that's, the Stonewall is such a fascinating story. And actually, when you think of the concept of the Stonewall, it was great. You think of the construction of the Stonewall, it was terrible. and just how it almost played major roles in both the Second Schleswig-Holstein War, the American Civil War. Like it almost fizzled out, but then it plays this critical role in the rise of the Japanese Imperial Navy and how
Well, think about this. We always play what ifs. We love doing that, especially about American Civil War. If those three Confederate national leaders who made it to Florida, made it out of Florida, but if they had made it to Havana Harbor and gotten on that ship would have destroyed those three gunboats, those U.S. gunboats, and gotten through the blockade at Galveston. And she would have gone right through that blockade.
Yes.
They would have ended up in Texas, and the war would have gone on.
And that was the big fear.
Now, and we can thank the Spanish governor of Cuba for paying off the ship's debts and convincing Page not to go out to sea. By the way, those three Confederate leaders never did make it to Cuba at that time. But those 450 men who were going to be the last men to die in the American Civil War lived. They ended up living.
Mm-hmm.
And if you apply the genealogical progression to those 450 men, today there are approximately 22,500 descendants in America today.
Mm-hmm.
Five, because those 450 men did not die. Isn't that amazing? Maybe some of our viewers tonight are one of those people.
They could be, couldn't they? And so I think, the stories we hear in Virginia, think of Battle of Hampton Roads as the greatest battle ever. But this war was not just huge battles, but really these small little engagements, the capture of blockade runners, the escape of blockade runners. Fort Clinch, which I've been to, you would have thought the Floridians could have defended it, but because they had no ships of their own supporting the fort, that fort fell without a shot. And it's quite a fortification. So is St. Augustine, where Kirby Smith was born.
Mm-hmm.
But, I like to say that Judah Benjamin and Breckinridge escaped from Florida in a boat that was sailed by John Taylor Wood, who was on the CSS Virginia. We've gone full circle here, I think.
Yeah, and actually they were in separate boats.
Yes.
At separate times. Benjamin came down through the island where I live, and Breckinridge was on the East Coast. Breckinridge actually went through a hurricane. His boat almost sank. He saved one guy's life. And did you know that John C. Breckinridge, Secretary of War of the Confederacy, legendary Vice President of the United States of America,
right,
under Buchanan until March 4th, 1861, ended up getting arrested as a pirate because they ended up draggled on this small vessel, small boat.
Mm-hmm.
And the Guardia Costa, the Coast Guard, the Spanish Coast Guard, was alerted to the fact that there was some piratical-looking guys in a small boat. Fishermen told them. They went out and arrested them. Now get this. Arrest them. They put them in shackles. They take them into Matanzas Harbor. They are leading them through the main street of Matanzas to the jail. And one of the people in the crowd was from Louisville, Kentucky. He was a businessman who had moved to Cuba years earlier. And he had been a friend of John C. Breckinridge. And he's standing in this crowd because he heard there was some pirates captured. And he looks out, and here is this guy who sure does look like the former Vice President of the United States of America. And sure enough, it's his old friend. And he goes to the Spanish officer and says, listen, Spanish lieutenant, he goes, you don't understand. This man you've got in shackles here, this is a former vice president of the United States of America. At that point, would you like to be that lieutenant?
No.
No. So immediately the shackles come off.
Yeah.
They are taken to the finest hotel in Matanzas. They are immediately then taken over to Havana, where they are treated like, visiting royalty. But just for a moment there, after this perilous escape by sea, they end up getting arrested. And but for expat ducking on the street,
What a fabulous story.
yeah.
And so we've actually shared some of my favorite stories, and I just have to say that I think we've had a pretty good time. I see that we have gone our hour, believe it or not. Now, I think Robert and I can talk for the next 10 hours, but anyway, I see, do we have any questions, Julie?
Yes, we do. Frank wants to know, Robert, what is the picture behind your right shoulder?
Thank you. That is a painting of the book of the all sailing gunboat in my first book, and that is the Rosalie. The Rosalie was a blockade runner that was captured in 1863, brought into federal admiralty court in the West, and adjudicated as a lawful prize of war, and then taken into the U.S. Navy, armed and crewed, and then sent on to the blockade squadron. Occasionally there are some bright bulbs in the federal government, just often enough that gives us hope. In 1863, in the late spring, they were trying to get more ships in the squadron, and so they decided they needed more smaller vessels that could penetrate bays and the rivers, and also other stuff. And what better vessel to use than blockade runners, which had been sailing that area? So this blockade ship now, this U.S. warship, 45 feet long, had a centerboard, and she ended up becoming one of the most successful at penetrating inner bays and capturing Confederate vessels all up and down, particularly the West Coast, Florida. He also assisted amphibious operations that were joint Army and Navy, and provided gunfire. Her last vessel that she captured was a steamer that she outsailed. She actually outran a steamer at Marco Island, which is now a big tourist spot. Marco Island in Southwest Florida, and she found them, captured that ship October of 1804. So that's a painting of the Rosalie.
Very good.
And I see that you have my books, the image of my books there. Those are my first 3 books that cover the Civil War. Painting cover of the blue book. That's my first book.
Wow.
And by the way, that book is dedicated to one of my ancestors, naval officer in the East Gulf blockading squadron during the war. Right here,
Fabulous.
I forgot to ask you gentlemen to do your hat trick before we started the questions. Like I explained, John and Robert are now good pals, and so we will now do the hat trick while they answer the questions. Onward and upward is Robert's slogan, and sink before surrender, huzzah, is John's. So anyway, the hats are now official, and we have parted the waters and brought us together tonight to talk about this.
That gets a great huzzah.
There you go.
Exactly.
Robert Allen wants to know, were there any railheads in Florida during the war?
Yes, there were rail lines that went from Jacksonville west toward Tallahassee, and then they curved north up into Georgia. One rail line that went down towards Pensacola from Alabama, and there was a rail line that went from Jacksonville, crossed the other rail line that went east and west, and this one went southwest. And that railroad went all the way across diagonally southwest to Cedar Keys, which lie off the coast. And so the rail line had actually a kind of a trestle causeway out to these places. And that was a relatively deep water port. That also was a big target for U.S. warships during the war. They did a joint Army-Navy raid on it and occupied that, took out that railhead. That railroad was owned one of our senators. For the war, he was the first Jewish Senator Levy, and Peter P. Benjamin of Louisiana, the second senator, and both were from southern states.
Thank you, Robert. John, Peter from Liverpool would like to know, as a tourist guide in Liverpool, I often say the final act of your Civil War was the surrender of the CSS Shenandoah in Liverpool. Is this true?
It is very true. In fact, the Shenandoah had fought on. They went up to the Bering Sea. Make a long story short, the Shenandoah was formerly the Sea King. She went up to the Bering Sea. She started sinking ships. Some of those whaler captains knew that the surrender had happened because they passed by and got in newspapers. And so when Waddell will capture a ship, they said, the war's over. You can't do this to us. He said, damn you, Yankee, we're going to burn you. And so he burned over, 21 whalers in like a 2-day period up in the Bering Sea. Then he meets a British bark and they say, well, the war really is open. Look at this newspaper. And they took off all their guns, and they then sailed out of the sailing lanes and went all the way back up to Great Britain. And I think it's November 3rd, 1865 is when the Shenandoah went into the harbor, and at that moment lowered the Confederate flag. So that really marks the true end of the Civil War. And it's a great story because they, Irvine Bullock, James Bullock, the great agent in Great Britain for the Confederacy, his brother was sailing master on the Shenandoah. His brother was also, Irvine Bullock, a midshipman on the CSS Nashville. He also serves as sailing master on the CSS Alabama. So you want to talk a guy that was everywhere a Confederate cruiser could go. You're talking about Irvine Bullock, and he's often forgotten. And but he stays in Great Britain after the war. Actually lives with his brother Theodore Roosevelt. Actually went over and saw them and sat on their knee, and that's why he wrote that naval book on the War of 1812. But one thing to tie to the museum, that the flag of the Alabama, the builder's model for the Alabama, and the flag from the CSS Nashville are all can be found in the Mariners Museum. So hey, huzzah!
That's right.
Yeah, there's, he was actually Theodore Roosevelt's uncle.
Yes.
Because he was in Theodore Roosevelt's mother's family.
Right.
And Roosevelt listened when he was young to these great sea stories. And of course, he read Semmes's memoirs, it was 700 pages. And he heard all these wonderful sea stories. That's what got him interested in sea. And he was a lifelong naval enthusiast from that moment on. And he heard it from the people that were actually out there doing it. Factor. The Shenandoah's next target after the Bering Sea go to, because they now realized that the war was over and everything they did was considered piracy. The war's over. But their next target was going to be San Francisco.
The gold
To go bombard the fort at an island called Alcatraz.
Right.
But they never did. So sometimes the story of history is the story of things that didn't happen that were supposed to happen.
Without a doubt. The Shenandoah, the idea was to capture all the gold they could to give money so the Confederacy could buy more ironclads. And the funniest thing is, unbeknownst to Waddell, was that the Federals had an ironclad in San Francisco Bay called the Comanche. This is the oddest story in the world because they build this ironclad at Secor City, New Jersey. It's a Passaic class. They build it, then they take it apart, number it, take it all the way around the Horn, up to San Francisco, and put her back together. And Confederates knew nothing about the existence of that ironclad. So I think the Shenandoah is better off going back to Liverpool, myself. But
that was a phenomenal voyage.
Oh,
From the Bering Sea, touching port, staying out of sight of land, all the way to Great Britain. That's a phenomenal feat of seamanship.
And that's Irvine Bullock, who's the sailing master. He has a fascinating story of the one of the memoirs of who was on the Shenandoah. I'll remember his name. William Conway Whittle is actually the original documents up in the what was once known as the Museum of the Confederacy, now the American Civil War Museum down in Tredegar. But I read that 30 some years ago, because I was interested in William Conway Whittle, and it was just the most amazing story. Even the Nashville, what he did with that. So I think we're all so lucky. Well, Robert and I are lucky as historians to have this rich treasure trove of so many powerful stories that, when combined and intertwined and woven into, a powerful tale, really makes you understand and almost makes you feel like you're there. Next question, I guess, Julie.
Yes, we've got a few more. Robert Lauren would like to know, where did the U.S. Navy set up coaling stations in Florida?
In Florida, the main coaling station was in Key West. And there were actually two coaling stations. There was one in Key West Harbor at what was known as the Mallory Dock. It was owned Stephen Mallory, who was the Confederate Navy. That's where he grew up. He wasn't born in the United States. He was actually born he grew up there. And then the second coaling station, which was really, it ended up becoming much larger. And you can still see the coaling docks today. And that was at Dry Tortugas at Port Jefferson. There were actually two coaling station docks where they had small hills, actually large hills, small mountains of coal. The ships that were heading to Farragut, heading to the West Gulf Blockade Squadron, that were coming around Florida, the lower Mississippi Squadron, they all refueled at the West. They had to. And so that was the main coaling area. Smaller coaling deposits As the war went on and the U.S. Navy ended up getting more and more penetration into the Florida coast, particularly around Jacksonville, they had some small coaling depots river in.
Now, what did Pensacola, that was still a Navy yard, did they do a lot there?
Yeah, but it was a Navy yard, but the Pensacola Navy Yard was actually on the mainland.
Mm-hmm.
They had to, that went back and forth a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
Protected. It was actually very vulnerable. By war, just didn't have enough troops in that area are really successful.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of recapture it. They did minor repairs that never during the war regained its pre-war importance.
Yeah.
After the war, it certainly did. After the war, it was a major naval station.
Yeah, the USS Seminole was built at Warrington Navy Yard. The Navy was really crazy. Here, the yard is in Portsmouth, but they call it Gosport Navy Yard. Everyone else calls it Norfolk Navy Yard. And like Boston Navy Yard, no, it's Charleston Navy Yard.
Yeah, exactly.
Not the New York Navy Yard, the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
Yeah.
Finally, they got their act together, but that's okay. It still makes for stirring thoughts. And Warrington, the namesake of that, was actually born here in Virginia. He was the illegitimate son of the Comte de Rochambeau, believe it or not.
There you go. You see?
Lewis Warrington, believe it or not.
In America, anybody can be anything.
You know it. I think there's a song about that somewhere in my past. But
it's probably in French.
Well, Robert, speaking of Pensacola, Bill is asking, how were freed Andersonville prisoners moved from Pensacola to Jacksonville by the Navy? And he comments that one of his relatives died there after being freed.
Okay. Say the question again.
How were freed Andersonville prisoners moved from Pensacola to Jacksonville?
Well, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one. There were two ways. You could go east by road, the railroad, at what time after the war had been repaired and sails east to Jacksonville, or you could go by ship. It probably, when Andersonville was liberated, probably they went by ship and they would have refueled at Key West and then come around. So that would have taken, that probably would have taken a week.
Okay. Avery asked, for either of you, any Bermuda Triangle type incidents during this time?
None to my knowledge. I don't know. Robert may know of one, but so many ships are lost at sea that you just don't know, like the USS Wasp during the War of 1812, it just disappeared. Rogue wave, like what happened to the Pride of Baltimore 1. And when you're in a sailing ship and in the wrong spot, and no one's around you to say, hey, it went down, they just disappear.
The USS Jacksonville, this the large cruiser, that was one of the largest ships in the Gulf Blockading Squadron. On New Year's Eve night of 1864-65, at 14 minutes past midnight, they didn't call it the Bermuda Triangle, but this is right in the Bermuda Triangle. At 14 minutes past midnight on New Year's Eve. So put this in context. Most of the officers are down below in the wardroom. There is ensign, who is the officer of the deck. Now, what do you think the officers were doing in the wardroom at 14 minutes past midnight on New Year's Eve?
I think I know.
Okay. I know.
I think we all know. And the ensign didn't realize that he was quite that close to the Bahama Islands. He knew he was close area. And they ended up, he ran the entire ship onto a reef and it was destroyed.
Ah,
And if that had happened in the 20th century, somebody would have probably said, oh, that was the Bermuda Triangle. And the ship captain on that one got in a lot of trouble. And he had to hire Bahamians, and get this, they charged him $300 in gold to sail two of his officers to Key West to report the loss of the largest ship in the squadron to the admiral. That was Cornelius Scribbling too.
okay.
And how would you like to be those guys? Admiral, reporting in, by the way, you don't have, and everybody was saved. They formed a refugee camp on the beach, and the Bahamians in that area are well-known wreckers. And they immediately started salvaging of everything down to the copper nails, and piled all this stuff on this island also. And they then sold it all back to the U.S. Navy.
Well done.
And the captain ended up going through a court martial.
Yeah.
Life got difficult for everybody. But in the official reports, they don't mention what was going on in the wardroom at 14 minutes past midnight on New Year's Eve.
I think later Rear Admiral Thomas Holdrup Stevens Jr. could tell you all about what was happening.
All about that, yeah. Keith asked Robert, was there communication between ships of the blockading force?
Yes, but it was obviously, they would send dispatch vessels around to supplies to these various, there were 38 ships. Now, whenever you're in any military formation, whether it's tanks or aircraft or ships, 38 are not on station, on patrol in operation every time. Some of them are resupplying, pairing, refitting. A lot of them were out there a long way from Key West. So they got some minor supplies and some messaging from Key West vessel. And it took a while, and that was it. And yes, they did communicate with each other. Their patrol zones would be, and so they'd come close. Of course, obviously they used signal flags if they were at a distance, but they would periodically meet each other.
And John, Keith asked, how many Confederate ships were able to break the blockade?
Well, that's an unknown number because of the smaller type of blockading runners. What I do know that in 1864, over 390 ships arrived and left Wilmington. 9 out of 10 blockade runners going into Wilmington made it in and made it out. So that would take, I think, probably a year of research to really come up with, and I know it can be done, because you just have to go through the official records and identify them, and of the ones that were captured. But I've never done that research, but it is there to be done. But certain ports became just untenable for the Confederates, like Charleston, Savannah, and some of the early blockade runners were schooners. And you take in a schooner trying to go into Charleston, and you got steamships, you ain't going to get in, I'll tell you, unless there's some type of ruse or storm. And you had to have excellent pilots because of the swash channels and so forth leading into some of these ports. To get into Hatteras Inlet, the chart said 8 feet of water, but it was only 6 feet of water. And so when Burnside comes down to attack Roanoke Island, he has to keg his ships in. And so, there are all these problems. And I don't think anyone has really gone into great detail about all those ships. I think, I know I could do it, but I think I'm doing something else this week. I don't.
Well, let me give a little info about the East Gulf blockades. 305 vessels running the blockade in their area of operation. Told you their area. Many of these were adjudicated as lawful prizes, and a number of them ended up becoming small windows. They were schooners and sloops. The blockade runners, we don't know how many made it. Keep big records down here in Florida. This was really a remote coast. However, we do know that in several of the other Gulf Coast harbors, we do know that, for instance, let me get my glasses. I'm at the age where I need about 90% that went into lower Georgia and East Coast, Nassau, in the British Bahamas. 80% of the blockade runners to the Gulf ports, either Havana or Matanzas, Cuba. 75% of the blockade runners to Matamoros, Mexico, and then over the border to Texas came from Havana or Matanzas. And we know that by late 1863 and all the way to the spring of 64, that was where the turning point was.
Right.
And in 1864, dwindling. For any of you who have been to Nassau, Nassau was a backwater village prior to the American Civil War. And in the first 2 years of the Civil War, Nassau quintupled, 5 times bigger than it was. And if you go to Nassau on a cruise ship, you'll walk around the street that's right along the waterfront, it's called Bay Street. Most of the old buildings there were warehouses for cargo. And those warehouses built during the Civil War, primarily to house cotton taken out of the country, and also some transshipping of cargo going into the fortunes were made in Nassau. Some of the largest homes in Nassau were built at that time. And also, for those of you who are sailors and you've been to Hopetown and that iconic lighthouse, the Candy Strike Lighthouse that everybody takes a picture of, that was built in 1864 to provide a safety navigation beacon for blockade runners. It was built by the British government. And the local islanders hated it, salvage wreckers. And this made it safer for the blockade runners to come into those northern Bahamian islands, particularly at Hopetown and in Green Turtle Key and those places. And so the locals were not amused by that. Safer. It did not help the USS San Jacinto, though, when she managed to wreck it.
Yeah, you can go to Bermuda and at St. George, there's the Globe Hotel. And, that was where the blockade runner captains, John Wilkinson and so forth, stayed. And so many of the buildings, I used to go to Bermuda a lot with my parents. And so it's amazing because the harbor hasn't really changed that much because everything kind of moved to Hamilton. So Hamilton wasn't a good harbor. St. George was, and so it became very, very popular. So and it made fortunes, and so some of which people still have that gold. So I like that. Any other questions, Julie?
No, I think I think that's it. We had lots of great comments in the chat. People enjoyed it, as I did, certainly, and it was a fabulous evening in the tropics with you gentlemen. I would like to let you know about the next evening lecture is this fabulous book, Guiding Lights, hard to see here, but the lighthouse on the cover of this book, the author lives in New Zealand. She will be my first international speaker for the evening lecture series. She is used a lighthouse that is at Mob Jack Bay, Virginia, right up the road from our museum. She had no idea when she agreed to speak to the Mariners Museum that she had chosen this image of this fabulous New Point Comfort light. Yet again, we are connected by the world's waterways in so many ways. So we look forward to welcoming Shona Riddell on April 8th at 7. Please sign up now on our virtual programming page and read our blogs, watch YouTube, follow Robert and his travels. When things open up, he'll start taking people to Havana again. I want to go. And John will get back out on the seas doing his lectures, and life will be good and sort of normal soon.
But life is good now, and we
Life
just
is
always
good.
have to remember to sink before surrender, right?
And onward and upward.
Onward and upward.
Onward and upward.
So thank you all so much for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again real soon. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I had a delightful time. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thrilled to have you both. Thank you so much. Good night.
Night.